So, about 7.5 years ago, I picked up the phone and called Todd Howard at the offices of Bethesda Game Studios. This was to talk about the making of a game called The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, the RPG that put Bethesda on the map with millions of sales across both PC and Xbox. It won numerous Game of the Year awards and proved that Western RPGs or computer role playing games could find overwhelming success on consoles. My impression of Todd then, as with many of the people I've interviewed who worked at Bethesda Game Studios over the years, was that he was sharp, creative, and most of all, incredibly charming. Howard serves as studio director at Bethesda and is probably the single most famous American video game designer, at least among younger, more modern audiences. He was a generous interview subject, and when I ran out of questions with another 10 or so minutes left in our meeting, he kept right on talking to fill the allotted time. I didn't have a chance to die of embarrassment at that moment. The conversation just flowed on without a missed beat, from the birth of Bethesda's rich modding community to the inspiration behind the original Elder Scrolls construction set. But we know companies that stick around tend to evolve over time, and not always for the best. For today's story, I spoke with several former and longtime Bethesda employees, under condition of anonymity, who described a medieval atmosphere emerging at the studio in the years following Skyrim and Fallout 4. As the company worked to repair its reputation through ongoing support for Fallout 76 and the launch of 2023's Starfield, expanding for multiple projects and mobile spin-offs, and then contracting again whenever Xbox brought the axe down, the Bethesda Game Studios, who made many of the most beloved video games of all time, began to look almost unrecognizable to many of the folks on the inside. My first clue that something had gone seriously awry with the development of The Elder Scrolls 6, perhaps the most anticipated non-Rockstar game in the history of the medium, came around the time of Starfield's release. A source reached out to tell me that two design veterans of Bethesda, both lead designers of Elder Scrolls 6 at some point or other, had suddenly left the studio in the same week. While the game is now being led by design director Alan Naines, the position, really just a fancier corpo way of saying lead designer, was originally held by Starfield lead quest designer Will Shen. Will was, quote, their best quest designer, according to the source. Meanwhile, veteran Elder Scrolls lore master Kurt Coleman, who's been, credited with helping to shape a lot of the mythology within that fictional universe since, his work on Daggerfall many years ago, told PC Gamer earlier this year that Howard had once verbally promised the lead design role to him. At that time, The Elder Scrolls 6 was slated to be the next big project immediately after Fallout 4. Instead, Starfield came along and the role of design director for that game went to Fallout 4 design lead Emil Pagliarulo. This broke one of the unspoken rules at BGS, which was that prior to Starfield, the same person wouldn't serve as lead designer on back-to-back projects. Fast forward to the production window for The Elder Scrolls 6 a couple years back, and the game is essentially now on its third lead designer, at least, with decades of institutional knowledge lost. It will definitely affect the future of the whole franchise, one source told me. Will and Kurt were Elder Scrolls Old Guard and fought to keep the series non-generic. But, that source said, there were no hard feelings between the two of them about the whole lead thing. I can only imagine that when Will left, Kurt probably said, okay, so it better be me or else, and they chose else. As for how this sort of drama can even happen at one of the most beloved and accomplished game companies in the world, another source I spoke to said many of the problems at Bethesda predate the Microsoft acquisition. I think it was the rapid expansion during Fallout 76. When we went from maybe 120 or 150 people in Rockville who made Fallout 4 to suddenly being 4 studios that were all called Bethesda Game Studios but had completely different cultures and ways of working, said the source. During Fallout 76, Todd became largely inaccessible to most of the people on the team. This was when they invented the new term SLT, meaning Senior Leadership Team, which really just meant Todd's inner circle. This didn't follow any true project organization. On Starfield, for example, the heads of the other BGS studios were part of the Starfield SLT. According to my source, however, this group did not include some of the project leads actually working on the game. Todd remains the sole decision maker about everything at Bethesda, the person said, and so the whole studio revolves around him like a medieval court around the king. Proximity to the king and the king's favor are everything. They never wanted anyone but Todd to show up on camera, another former Bethesda developer told me. He very much has an inner political circle, and it's super political with a lot of yes people. For years, team meetings would often include an open floor Q&A session where employees could submit questions or feedback to upper management. They stopped doing that as soon as feedback got increasingly critical, said one source. Things got overly corporate, and they weren't honest with themselves about how things were really going. Todd only hears from people who agree with him, another source told me. People who were willing to openly disagree with him or challenge him are gone or pushed outside the magic circle of SLTs, which has become quite a term of derision within BGS at this point. Todd truly believed that Bethesda was the best place to work in the industry. And so anyone who suggested that our turnover rate was perhaps a problem that needed to be dealt with was dismissed as disloyal. All problems were with the individuals, not the studio. But that source points out, happy employees wouldn't have reason to form the first video game developer union in the history of the United States. I'd be very curious how Todd rationalized that, the person said. Most likely that the people supporting the union are all disloyal. It hasn't gone unnoticed that the layoffs seem to fall disproportionately on vocal union supporters. Even before ZeniMax Workers United went public, as more critical voices began speaking up or challenging leadership, people like Howard, Emil Pagliarulo, managing director Ashley Chang, or studio director Angela Browder, they'd be labeled a troublemaker internally and punished, though never by Todd directly. Once someone's on the blacklist at BGS, it's almost impossible to get off of it, said one person with intimate knowledge of the studio. Skyrim lead designer Bruce Naismith had gotten on it for some reason around the time of Fallout 4, and so he was demoted from being design director in favor of Emil, and then basically just treated poorly for the rest of the whole time until he finally quit. That kind of thing was standard for people who got on someone's bad side. In other words, on the bad side of someone from the so-called inner circle. But Todd's tendency is always to avoid confrontation at all costs, that source observed. When there's bad news to be delivered, either because one person's being demoted or a whole swath of workers are losing their jobs, Howard sort of conveniently would have someone else play the messenger so that he could maintain the narrative of being fundamentally, quote, on their side, with bad decisions coming from another member of studio leadership or the larger Microsoft boogeyman. The king is good, in other words, his advisors are bad. And because workers at Bethesda were treated as separate from Microsoft in material ways, they didn't get the same attractive benefits packages as software developers within Microsoft proper, for instance, it came as quite a shock to some folks when the first waves of Xbox layoffs started impacting Bethesda too. Todd has always had the superpower to come across as extremely likable, said one source. That obviously has made him an excellent spokesman for BGS over the years. And it still seems that some people inside BGS are clinging to that belief. To me, that seems extremely delusional. Howard exists, quote, in a bubble of yes men of his own creation, the person added. When I asked that particular source what players might expect from The Elder Scrolls 6, they said, I don't have high hopes. Under Phil Spencer and past Xbox leadership, Bethesda Game Studios certainly faced its share of challenges, and a lot of what we're seeing today, the constant brand strategy changes, the unionization efforts and the fight against them, boycotts against the larger Xbox brand, mass waves of layoffs, is a direct result of decisions made during Spencer's tenure when Microsoft acquired ZeniMax Media, Bethesda's parent company, for $7.5 billion. But Microsoft PR and Xbox CEO Asha Sharma have been crafty, even as 3,200 people lose their jobs in 2026 and untold thousands more before them. Talk of an Obsidian Fallout game and doubling down on beloved IP like Halo and the Elder Scrolls has done a good job of getting gamers to avert their eyes from the bloodbath. However you feel about the prospect of future games in a series you like, I implore you to remember the human costs here. Think critically about the cult of personality around Todd Howard and other industry figureheads. There's a reason Microsoft deploys these people like party tricks with one hand, while they gut their workforce and enable war crimes abroad with the other. If you want more behind the scenes scoops and deep dives into games and the people who make them, be sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know what else you'd like to see from me. I actually have a whole 10 episode series on one of my favorite RPGs coming up next month. So see you next time.